So the second thing I want to talk to you guys about is it's something here that I feel like it's extremely important, right? Because if you want to get into the market, you also have to know the other side of things, which is the way consumers, right? Which the way consumers are going to want to look at purchasing property. So this is for my folks who are consumers. And when I call you consumers, it's not in a bad way. It's more about you are the person who are looking for a home. You want to provide a home for your family. You want to make sure that everybody in the home, everybody has a roof over their head as far as your family member is concerned. You wake up every morning, you work that hard job that a lot of us investors don't really get to do, right? I mean, the blue collar workers, so much respect for you guys. You guys are the reason the economy continues to go around. But these consumers, these folks who are these blue collar workers who would be the ones to buy the homes or rent the homes from investors, it's important for you guys to know the steps on getting yourself into that first home. Now, I hear this all the time, right? Loan officers, especially residential loan officers, no knock on them because I also happen to fall in that category too. We do residential loans for people looking to buy homes, right? For residential loan officers, we use the term generational wealth when we are talking about buying a home that you would live in. Quite frankly, it's not true. It's not generational wealth. It's actually generational liability because it sets you back at least 30 years on every 30-year note that you take. It's just how it is. Again, like I mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, the bank is a business. The bank's job is to find ways to continue to keep this business working, right? So that's why they have to take capital from from the typical consumer, in the case yourself or me, and they take that capital and they use rent or lease that capital back to us, give that capital back to us to use to purchase bigger items, and then they make interest on that capital. So if you wanted to buy a home and you said, man, how can I buy a home in today's market? What I did was I found something on Rocket Mortgage. So I'm going to give credit to Rocket Mortgage for this. I appreciate them sharing this article. But what it did was it actually talks about how you can now have the ability to buy a home and by the steps that you need to take to be able to buy a home, right? So I wanted to hamper on a few things here when it comes to buying a home. And when I say I want to hamper on a few things, I wanted to make sure that you guys saw the most important things that you needed to know when it comes to buying a home. They talked about buying a home is a major commitment. I agree. It's an extremely expensive venture that you have to take on. So you need to know that this is what you're getting yourself into. Unfortunately, a lot of us don't know that, right? So a lot of us get into these homes. We think we're buying something we're going to get to pass down to our children. What I'm going to tell you is this. I've never met a person who took a 30-year mortgage and in 30 years paid off that mortgage. Very, very few, I would say, maybe venture to say about 5% of the people who take out 30-year mortgages pay off their loans in 30 years. This is why. Because a lot of people end up refinancing that debt multiple times, and each time they refinance their debt. And I would venture to say that in today's market, you have around 80 to 90% of people who took out 30-year mortgages and passed away with still liens on their property. So not only do you have to pay an estate tax, chances are that you also have to pay off the lien before you can even see any kind of profit or any kind of quote unquote equity, right? So you're counting on the appreciation of the property, which if you're in today in 2022 or 2023, and you've seen how houses have devalued extremely high, you can't even call that equity anything, right? So let me give you an example. I had a property that I purchased for $150 in about 2021. I was looking to sell it, but I said I wasn't going to sell it because it was a rental property. That property was worth $275,000. I purchased it for $150 in 2017. Well, in 2022, that same property that was worth $275,000 in January of 2021, at the height or the peak of real estate being a boom, or even down to December of 2021, that house now is only worth $190,000. So what that means is that's almost $80,000 to $85,000 in value that I lost on that property. The reason is because properties, just like the stock market, just like every investable asset, does go through appreciations and depreciation. So I'm telling you all of this to say this. How can you count on something that is going to potentially depreciate so much in value and consider that an investable asset if you don't have an investment strategy going into it. For example, if you purchase a home for $100,000, we talked about price versus cost, right, in the beginning of this call. If you purchased a home for $100,000 and it cost you $50,000 to maintain that property over the life of your ownership. So you own this property for 30 years. You purchased it for $100,000. It cost you $50,000 to maintain this property. Now that property's real price or real cost is $150,000. Okay, so now let's assume that you also had to pay taxes, because in the United States, like other Western countries and most countries, you have to pay taxes on your property. So let's assume you're paying another, you've had this for 30 years, so you're paying taxes at $3,000 a year, right? Which is not a lot, just a little bit. So this now puts you at about $90,000, right, for taxes over 30 years. So that's $100,000 for the purchase, $90,000 for the $90,000 for the taxes, $50,000 for the maintenance, and then your insurance. Maybe your insurance costs you $1,000 a year. You have it over 30 years. That's $30,000. Now you're looking at what? $190,000 plus $50, $240 plus $30, $270,000. Now let's assume that home appreciated in that 30-year span. It became 3x what you bought it for. So you bought it at $100,000, and in 30 years, that house is now what? $300,000. Woohoo! Your house has grown so far in value. Well, when you decide to eventually sell that house and you look at what your overall cost in that property is, you guys can do the math. You only made $30,000 in equity over the span of 30 years. So now let's assume you passed away, God forbid, right? You passed away and you handed this fat property over to your family. The state or your family decides that they want to sell it, right? It's generational wealth, like you called it. And they sold this property, and they sold it for $300,000. Max value, they got every single penny out of it. Well, the part that you're missing is your family has to pay what's called an estate tax. Estate taxes usually range between anywhere from 20% to 30%. Okay, let's assume you have a very good lawyer. Again, as the numbers go higher, this estate numbers, the taxes and the tax numbers go higher, right? At certain dollar figures, you don't have to pay that much of an estate tax. But for the sake of argument, we're using easy numbers. So let's assume that now your family has to pay a 20% on the lower end of the spectrum, a 20% estate tax on a $300,000 purchase. That's $60,000 that they had to pay. So let's go back to your equity calculation. You spent $270,000 on the property that only went up to $30,000. Your family resold it. Your family sold this property after 30 years that you've passed away, and they realized a gain of $240,000. Well, the issue is the cost of ownership of that property was $270,000. So what does that tell you? It tells you now that your family is upside down $30,000 on a $100,000 purchase you made 30 years ago. I know the way I said this is a little confusing, but when you think about what I said and you pay a lot of attention to what I said, you realize that this is not a generational wealth strategy. It is a generational liability strategy. That's why investors do this. Investors take their money, they purchase a piece of real estate, and they make somebody else pay for it in form of rent. A landlord purchases a home. He understands this is an asset that is going to make money for a business called a bank. And he uses that same assets to make an income for himself, and he realizes nothing but gains. Because guess what? That same $100,000 that he purchased for $100,000, he didn't have to pay $100,000 to purchase the property. The tenant does. The $50,000 that comes from the taxes or the maintenance, the tenant pays for that, right? In form of the realized rent. The taxes that come from that are the $90,000 in taxes is paid by the tenant. The $30,000 in insurance is paid by the tenant. So you might rent a property. You might see a landlord who has a property that he's only making $100 to $200 a month from. So he's not making a whole lot of money per se. But you do understand that every single penny that is going into this asset that the bank is using to make money, he's making money. This is, again, like I said, how you play the game. Remember, I gave you guys a nugget on how to play the game from an interest rate perspective. This is how landlords play the game from a housing perspective. So for those of you that want to be consumers or even want to be investors, want to buy your first home, these are some steps that I think you should take. First, decide whether you are ready to buy that home, right? Know what kind of home it is. Know what location you're buying. Secondly, if you're buying it for yourself and not as an investment, you want to know what income and employment, what your income looks like now, what employment strategies you're using, and what your foreseeable income will look like in the future, including in a time of a recession. If you're a doctor, you're a nurse, you're a lawyer, your income probably doesn't get affected as much as if you work in a mortgage company. Okay, so debt to income ratio is important to know. You want to know how to calculate the debts that you have right now. So your car payment, your credit card payment, everything that you consider a debt that you have to pay for every month, even including your housing payments, to how much your income is. So for example, if you're making, in this case if you're making $6,000 a month, but your total expenses include your credit card, minimum payments, every loan that you have, everything, sometimes even your utilities, if everything comes out to $2,000 a month, well, now you're at a 33% debt to income ratio. So you want to know how to calculate that number, because a lot of people, unfortunately, like homes that they really can't afford. And that's what's going on in today's market. And that's what caused the crash in 2008. Next is liquid assets, right? So how much cash do you have available in the bank? How much cash have you been able to save up? How much cash can you put into the property? Again, like I said, it's never really a good idea to spend money buying a home. You might think to your friends you look like you're rich, right? Because you bought this really big home. Everybody comes and sees it. But for those who have a good eye, who understand investments in the United States, they see you as somebody who is buried, right? That home is really more or less a funeral home for you, because all that thing is doing is burying you in debt. But if you're the person who wants to still, move forward to purchasing a home for your reasons, then absolutely. This is another strategy that you need to understand, is what kind of liquid assets you have. Your credit health is important, right? So there are ways to understand how to manage your credit so you have a good and solid credit. And then the most important thing is exactly what I said, the willingness to live in one place. A mortgage can be a 30-year long commitment. You might not live in a home for 30 years, but it's usually difficult to move. What did I call it? Your funeral home, right? When you purchase it, it's where you're going to be buried at, right? I mean, really, it's more of a cemetery than a funeral home, but it's, that's a cemetery. That home that you're buying and you're saying you want to make this the property that you spend the rest of your life in, right? It's more of a cemetery because you don't have the flexibility and the ability to move around. That's why intelligent investors and those who have a little bit more capital do not go around buying big pieces of real estate. What they do is they purchase real estate for investment purposes and they give themselves freedom to move around. Now, don't get me wrong. I have friends that are extremely wealthy that have $15 to $16 million homes in different parts of the world. So these folks can afford to keep a home empty. I have a friend, nice lady, friend of mine. She has 2 homes, each worth over $2 to $3 million each. She doesn't even live in any of those homes. She doesn't have it rented out because she doesn't want anybody sleeping on those beds. But these $1 million homes just sit idle, right? She pays taxes on it. But when you're worth a little bit over $145 million, then that's not really that big of a deal to you. But for those of us who are, working and doing the things that we have to do, that are making between $60,000, $70,000 to $200,000 to $300,000, you can't afford to have 3-4 homes just sitting idle and you paying taxes on it. So your willingness to live in one place becomes extremely, extremely important when you decide if you're going to be purchasing a home or not. A lot of people don't think about that. A lot of people want to show themselves to their friends how great they are, how far they've come in life. So that's all they care about, right? See what I can do, see what I can do, see what I have. And guess what that does to you? That puts you in a very bad position and it gets you stuck. And then the last part of this that I also want to talk to you guys about, because again, I think this is extremely important knowledge. I think this is very helpful. I think a lot of you guys are going to see how beneficial this could be, is investors understanding the market and, most importantly, what you need to expect as far as returns, or how you get to navigate a down market.